Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the 10th anniversary of Social Justice Week at Ryerson. As people find their way in cyberspace and get into the session and settle in, you can take in some information about us on this slide here. It tells you all the ways that you can get in touch with us by email on our website, how to follow us on social media. And please do follow us and reach out to us because we want to hear from you. We want to know what your thoughts are and we want your feedback. You can tweet using the hashtag Social Justice Week 2020 and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Today we are going beyond borders to bring you Global Black Resistance with Pascal de Verlis, Stephanie Leach, and Professor Angela Figueroa, with translation provided by Eudes Lopez. My name is Kike Roach, and I'm the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy here at Ryerson. As we turn our minds to a discussion today that reflects on the freedom struggles of Africans in the diaspora, we remember our ancestors whose courage, labor, determination, wisdom, and teachings, whose resistance and determination made it possible for us to be here today. And we're really grateful for all of their struggles. To bring you this event does take the work of many. So I want to say my thanks to, first of all, to Dr. Winnie Ng, who had the great idea of founding Social Justice Week 10 years ago. I want to say a particular thanks to Professor Beverly Bain of the Women and Gender Studies program in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus, who was really instrumental in helping us put this event together. Thanks also to our sponsors, the Faculty of Arts, Dean Pamela Sugerman, the Faculty of Community Services, Dean Lisa Barnoff, to all our sponsors, our community partner, A Different Book List Cultural Center. We also want to thank our ASL team today from Toronto Sign Language Interpreters, Marcia, who you see right now, and Anissa. Our captioning team at CCS, Corinne is helping us, and Brian of Media Services team, as well as our communications team, Julia and Noshin. I want to say a very particular thank you and a big, big thanks actually to Salman Khan, who's been with Social Justice Week since its inception in 2011 and whose amazing work we've relied on year after year. Thank you so much, Salman. Today, we're really delighted that Pascal de Verlis is here to both moderate and join in the conversation with our international guests. You can read her fuller bio on our website, but just know that Pascal de Verlis is a woman of many talents. Originally from Port-au-Prince, Haiti, she's a writer, community builder, communications specialist. She's an educator, an independent consultant, a grassroots organizer, winner of multiple awards, and she's also worked on Social Justice Week planning committees as well. Pascal has co-founded Black Lives Matter Toronto, which was the actual first international chapter of the Black Lives Matter movement, a trans feminist movement committed to the preservation of Black art, Black space, Black families, and Black life. She's coordinated many of the direct actions, including some of BLMTO's biggest actions, the tent city in front of police headquarters following the police killing of Andrew Loku, as well as halting Toronto Pride to highlight the over-policing of the city's Black, queer, and trans community. Take it away, please, Pascal.
Hello, thank you for that intro, Kike. My name is Pascal. I will be your moderator for this conversation, Global Black Resistance. Today's the second day of Social Justice Week, the 10th year anniversary. This year's theme, Beyond Walls, Beyond Borders, could not come at a better time. And while Social Justice Week looks a little differently this year, you know, we're not able to come in Lib 72 for Ryerson folks. We're not joining in TRSM. We're trying to find community through these computer screens. That being said, I still want to recognize that I will be moderating this panel from the traditional meeting ground of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga people. This territory is within the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This treaty commits these nations to share this territory in peace, friendship, and respect. And all newcomers are invited into this treaty in the spirit of those obligations. And I also want to take a note to remind us that these are obligations. I also want to recognize that the same colonial state that is enacting genocide on Indigenous people here have been in my home country, have been in Haiti with their imperialist agenda. And I say this to say that as a displaced African person, as a Black person, as a Haitian person, our struggles are actually intrinsically connected. And ultimately, so is our liberation. That being said, I still recognize that it is still my collective responsibility, is our collective responsibility to protect, honor, and sustain this land. I'm so happy to be having this conversation, to be able to join it. There really, truly is no better time. We've been in a global uprising for months now that really sees no clear end. Direct action, art interventions, protests, rallies, and so many different forms of mobilization have been happening across the globe. Black people globally are resisting state-sanctioned violence, are standing up and resisting anti-Black racism in all spheres. It really is truly an amazing thing to see. The status quo is no longer viable, and Black feminists are truly rebuilding a world for us, by us. Without further ado, I do want to welcome our first speaker who will share her expertise. Stephanie Leach. Stephanie is a queer activist and decolonial scholar from Trinidad and Tobago. She heads the feminist nonprofit organization Womantra, and has recently been thrust into the role of organizer for TT Black Lives Matter. Much of her work in the TT-BLM collective has been around police brutality and the extrajudicial killings of Black people from poor and stigmatized communities. Prior to this most recent wave of advocacy, Stephanie has been engaged in emancipation efforts for the last 10 years, including coordinating Diego Martin's annual Kumbule procession and the Emancipation Support Committee's Transatlantic Trade and Investment Business Symposium. In her current post as trustee to the International Union for Health Promotion and Education, Stephanie has been able to influence the scholarship and advocacy priorities of the North American Regional Office, including co-authoring 2 publications for Public Health Journal, Health Promotion International, Deconstructing Hegemonic Eschatologies, An Urgent Call for Anti-Racist Scholarship for Health Promotion in Black Lives, and Black Lives Matter and Health Promotion, Moving from Unspoken to Outspoken. Stephanie is committed to intersectional praxis in her political analysis and activism, particularly the intersections of gender, class, and race. I would like to make some space for Stephanie and give her a very, 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 very warm welcome. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is in good spirits. I know I am. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction, Pascal. And I would like to acknowledge our interpreter as well, Marcia. Thank you. So I am really, honored to be a part of this conversation about global Black resistance, because the Caribbean has always been very central to that conversation and that resistance. I think in a more global discourses we're sometimes left out. And so I think it was really important to have a Caribbean perspective represented in this discussion. As a post-colonial society, we have a long history of resistance. The Caribbean was also very much in tune with the Black Power movements of the 70s. And now with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Caribbean again has different pockets of resistance resurfacing, including in Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from. What happened to George Floyd really sparked global outrage and presented a really unique moment for Black people to unite. And it really is quite amazing how that manifested throughout the world. Even here in Trinidad, we had solidarity actions outside of the American embassy, which I suppose was symbolic. But following those initial protests, there were the killings of 3 men from MOVA Joel Jacobs, Noel Diamond, and Israel Clinton, which sparked nationwide protests because they were killed by the police. You know, the kind of narrative that we hear coming out of the killing of citizens by police is that there was some kind of clash, there was an exchange of ammunition, and, you know, they ended up dead. But in this particular instance, we had clear video evidence from CCTV camera footage, as well as from neighbors, that these men literally had their hands up in the air and were gunned down by the police. And one of the men, it was actually his birthday, and he was just celebrating his birthday with his friends. And I think the spirit of Black Lives Matter really encouraged a type of resistance that I have not seen in my lifetime, because I wasn't around in the 70s. But we saw Black people, particularly non-activists, just regular folk from poor communities, from communities where police brutality is really targeted, rising up on their own and taking to the streets and chanting with signs. And it led to 3 days of peaceful protest, but was also met with increased police brutality, as we have seen throughout the world, in similar instances in the US and all the way to Nigeria with what's happening now with the End SARS movement. I know I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the theme, which is Beyond Walls, Beyond Borders. And I think that this space presents some of that ethos, which is that Black people all over the world are connected by a particular history of oppression that continues to exist. And like, you know, the title of one of these papers I worked on, we have to move from unspoken to outspoken, and really shining a light on these things that have been, you know, existing and morphing really into ways where it's becoming more and more difficult in some ways for us to articulate the ways in which we are dehumanized. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for highlighting the circumstances that are happening in TNT right now. Definitely, you know, I think about the start at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how these conversations were so difficult because, you know, we've only really conceptualized or maybe fed an image of police brutality only happening in the American context, and having to have a conversation that broadens these issues as global issues. And the truth of the matter is, no matter where you go, whether there are majority of Black folks or not, police brutality is going to be an issue for us consistently. And we are a stigmatized community that is targeted over and over and over again. And I know how difficult it is to have these conversations, particularly amongst Black people, and particularly amongst communities that are solely or predominantly Black, rather, because of how we are fed of how this is an American problem. But we know that this is really global, and what is happening right now is showing us how much of a global conversation that this is, and the police globally are targeting Black communities. Thank you so much for that intro.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to continue to keep us moving to our second speaker before we dive into questions. And Angela Figueroa is an anthropologist and a professor in the Afro-Brazilian Studies and Gender Studies Department at Federal University of Bahia. She is also an associate professor at the Center for Arts, Humanities, and Letters at Federal University of Recôncavo of Bahia. She is coordinator of the Angela Davis Collective, an activist research group in the areas of gender, race, and subordination at UFRB, and coordinator of the first International Black Feminism Thought School, created in 2017. Angela is a member of the Marielle Franco Forum, an organization focused on the empowerment of Black women in politics. As a researcher, she has worked in the areas of racial and gender inequalities, Black culture, the Black middle class, Black beauty, Black identity, Black feminism, Black domestic work, inspired by Black feminist perspectives. She has presented her research in 2 documentary films, Deusa de Urbano and Dialogues with the Sacred. She was the curator of the Global African Hair exhibition that took place in Salvador. She has published several books: New Colored Elites, a study on Black professionals in Salvador, Black middle class trajectories and profiles, Beleza Negra. In recent years, she has published articles in the area of gender inequality, race and racism, and Black feminist thoughts. Angela will also be supported by Eudice Lopez, who will be translating for her, is a cultural anthropologist completing a PhD at Cornell University and trained in public policy at Princeton University. His research grapples with cosmic alignments of state power across the New World. Thank you both for being here. Thank you both for sharing your expertise. I'll leave the floor with you.
Posso começar? Obrigado, Pascali, pela introdução. E eu gostaria de agradecer muito pelo convite, pela oportunidade de compartilhar as experiências nesse painel.
I'd like to thank Pascal for the introduction and for the invitation to be able to speak at this event.
Bom, eu gostaria de aproveitar inicialmente para apresentar o contexto social e político brasileiro antes de eu falar um pouco mais da solidariedade negra.
I want to first begin by just giving a larger context behind the situation in Brazil now before speaking to the resistance on the ground.
Cadê? Ai, meu Deus, cadê? Sorry.
And there's a minor delay. We're getting the presentation ready.
Não tenho ainda, não consegui. Cadê?
We're having a little bit of an issue with the screen share. There we go.
É preciso, antes mesmo de falar da resistência negra, pensar sobre alguns aspectos importantes do Brasil, em termos de população negra no Brasil, em termos de percentuais de pessoas negras no Brasil. Nós, de acordo com o último dado das pesquisas em 2014, nós pela primeira vez somos maioria negra no Brasil, porque eu acredito que tudo isso vai criar um contexto diferenciado em que a população negra é minoria. Então a gente vai falar de solidariedade, de violência no contexto em que nós negros somos maioria.
So before speaking about resistance, there are aspects to the Brazilian context that are worth noting. First, demographically, the population is majority Black. And for the first time, the census is now beginning to reflect that. And that new affirmation speaks volumes to how activism is changing on the ground.
Então, o Brasil é um país de tamanho continental, como tem sido dito. Nós somos 205 milhões de habitantes, com uma desigualdade forte. Então, obviamente, essa desigualdade afeta majoritariamente a população negra, com passado de escravidão durante um longo tempo, e com processos históricos que indicam a permanência da escravidão nas relações sociais e nas instituições democráticas.
Some aspects of the social processes behind our history, and also the nature of the country and its size. It's a continental-sized country with hundreds of millions of people, with a long past, legacy. The legacy of slavery is very felt. And very much stitched together into the present through institutional processes and the grip of inequality.
E com processo cultural de mestiçagem que levou, digamos assim, a uma certa dificuldade na assunção de uma identidade negra entre nós brasileiros. Então, eu estou falando de um contexto em que somos maioria agora, embora no passado fôssemos maioria em termos de não sermos brancos, mas não havia uma autodeclaração e uma consciência da negritude.
And it's important to note, too, the specificities of how racialization would take root in the Brazilian context with the miscegenation process, having a unique kind of potent force in shrouding the affirmation of Blackness throughout Brazilian history.
Eu gostaria de falar um pouco do contexto social brasileiro, de um governo autoritário, um desmonte das instituições democráticas, né? Uma falta de financiamento, redução do financiamento, uma militarização, todo um contexto, digamos, político e social de enfraquecimento das instituições democráticas e, de certo modo, uma desautorização ao ativismo político. Então, nós temos vivenciado, durante o governo de esquerda, um crescimento desse ativismo político, e agora, nesse contexto de crescimento, por um lado, das igrejas neopentecostais e do conservadorismo de suas agendas. Então, tudo isso, digamos assim, jogando um papel importante no enfraquecimento das mobilizações negras, por um lado, e, por outro lado, o fortalecimento dessas organizações. Então, a gente tem um momento extremamente tenso de resistência e de conservadorismo que talvez a gente não tenha tido memória recente na história brasileira.
So to speak a bit also to the specificities of the political context, we have now an authoritarian government in power, militarizing the country, a context that is rife with institutions increasingly fragile and weakened, especially democratic institutions. We see a backdrop of the total criminalization of even activism itself, with a conservatism that has taken root, that is being protagonized and fueled by a religious right that is dividing the Black community in Brazil.
E de uma escalada também tanto de militarização, por um lado, e de milícias, né? As milícias destruindo, digamos assim, a perspectiva democrática, assumindo posições do Estado e de representação política e assumindo a violência, e, por outro, também uma escalada da violência contra a mulher. Eu estou dando esse contexto extremamente difícil para que a gente entenda como a resistência, para nós, tem sido dificultada por conta desse contexto sócio-histórico.
And this escalation is being felt and seen in not just the militarization of state institutions in the most formal sense, but also in their allies and their alliances with militias that are increasingly blurring the lines between state violence and the violence on the ground. This escalation of violence is being felt very acutely, most acutely against women. And I want to stress this because it gives a sense to how grim the situation is and what we're pit against as we think about what activism might look like in this context.
Aqui eu apresento essa tela com os dados sobre homicídios, né? E o número de como nós negros somos mais vitimados pelo homicídio, por sermos vítimas do homicídio, a idade em que as pessoas negras são também maior vítima do homicídio, o que as mulheres negras também são mulheres que são mais vítimas do feminicídio no Brasil. Todo um quadro, digamos assim, de permanência de um racismo antinegro ou de práticas antinegras que impossibilitam, além de intensificar a violência, impossibilita, digamos assim, uma vivência efetivamente democrática.
I want to also present some of the raw data of the violence and how it's being felt. This is acutely made visible through the rate of homicides, which is highest among the Black community, and how this kind of anti-Blackness and is not only threatening the existential possibilities of the Black community and Black women, but precluding our very sense of what it can mean to live in a democratic society.
Bom, aqui eu vou falar um pouco, depois do contexto, de como o movimento Black Lives Matter impactou o Brasil, mas assim, impactou muito mais do ponto de vista do modo como a mídia deu maior atenção a práticas violentas que já vinham sendo denunciadas pelo ativismo negro, por nós feministas negras e pelo ativismo negro de um modo geral. Essa cena é de um policial branco pisando na cabeça de uma mulher negra, repetindo, de certa forma, o mesmo gesto que matou George Floyd.
I want to also speak to global movements and how they're being felt on, being seen and taken up on the ground in Brazil. Black Lives Matter has made its way and is now increasingly a rallying cry within Brazil. It's something that has been a rallying cry among Brazilian Black activists, but now it's a language that is, you can begin to see and is being heard across the wider media landscape, which is a new phenomenon. I want to give attention to just one case in particular with a woman who is, to this day, the name of whom we still are yet to has yet to be publicized, and she also would be, suffer the kind of violence that we saw in the case of George Floyd.
Então, o que quero dizer com isso é se, por um lado, o movimento Black Lives Matter impactou e estimulou um maior número de pessoas a filmar ações de violência, a denunciar a violência, sobretudo nas redes sociais, no contexto de pandemia, mas também teve atos públicos, ocupação de rua. Ele também, de algum modo, estimulou os policiais a reproduzirem o gesto violento. Então, a gente está num embate de, por um lado, a ação, que é inspirada ou que é motivada, porque a gente já tem uma luta antirracista muito grande, mas, por outro, os policiais que reproduzem o mesmo gesto como uma espécie de, também, resistência a essa nossa denúncia, essa nossa luta por direitos e por uma sociedade não racista.
So it's important to stress how this is being taken up in ways that are antagonizing too within Brazilian society, where Black Lives Matter not only empowers activists, empowers the Black community to report, to call out acts of police violence, but also emboldens. We see the emboldening of the actual perpetrators of this violence, police officers who now see techniques that are being called out in other contexts and openly making use of those techniques, those acts of violence, in the name of a solidarity with that kind of fascism.
Então, esse é a foto de um menino de 5 anos assassinado, porque a mãe dele, durante a pandemia, ela foi trabalhar, deixou a criança sob os cuidados da patroa, enquanto ela saiu para passear com o cachorro da patroa, e o menino subiu no elevador e morreu. Se jogou, né? Caiu, mas ele estava sob o cuidado da patroa, que é Sari Corte. Então, eu tomei exemplo de 3, eu vou citar um outro, 3 eventos que foram emblemáticos para pensar a mobilização em torno das vidas negras. Então, no caso desse menino, é um exemplo contundente da ausência, digamos, de humanidade. A pessoa que ficou com ele não considerava ele exatamente um humano ou uma criança, tanto que permitiu que ele subisse o elevador, uma criança de 5 anos sozinho, o que acabou ocorrendo o assassinato dele.
So I want to give just 3 cases. This is the second, and to speak to how this is flaring up in the Brazilian context, and this is a case where very indicative and exemplary in the Brazilian context of the dehumanization of Black lives, where a domestic worker on the job, trusting her own employer to look after her child as she worked on her behalf. The negligence would cause the boy to fall off the building and to his death. And it's a case that hits a nerve because it speaks to how prevalent that dehumanization is.
O terceiro caso é de uma criança que foi vítima de violência sexual, ela foi estuprada e ela foi inicialmente negado o direito a ela de ter o aborto, e quando a justiça garantiu a ela o direito de abortar, houve uma série de, essa foto é uma série de militantes, ativistas de direita, que foram até lá se posicionar contrário ao aborto realizado pelo Estado. Então, é claro que eu estou misturando o aborto aqui, mas é num contexto que eu quero levar mais adiante de perdas de direito, e de conservadorismo, e de retrocesso, de racismo, violência contra a mulher e a negação do direito à realização do aborto caminham juntos. Quer dizer, são complexidades de uma sociedade que se torna cada vez mais retrógrada.
So for the final case, I want to draw attention to a victim of rape, a 12-year-old victim of rape, who was denied the right, her reproductive rights, her right for an abortion, given an exemption. And in the moment where the abortion was to be administered, activists, right-wing fascist activists, on the doorstep of the hospital to try to stop her from being able to exercise her reproductive rights. And it's an example that really speaks to how intersectional this is all becoming, and how how feminicide, how misogyny is working hand in hand with this kind of racism.
Aqui eu apresento alguns dados sobre a violência contra a mulher, mas eu não tenho certeza se eu vou ter tempo suficiente para explorar. Eu tenho quanto tempo de fala ainda, Eudes? Você lembra?
So Angela wants to know, is her time up, or does she have a minute or so to finish?
Feel free to keep going.
Okay, pode continuar, mas pode continuar.
Posso continuar quanto tempo?
How much time do you know?
About 3 to 4.
3 to 4 minutes.
Então eu vou pular tudo isso. Eu quero falar de como no Brasil nós nos articulamos solidariamente em função do assassinato de Marielle Franco, que é um nome conhecido mundialmente. Nós reconceituamos o assassinato de Marielle Franco como um feminicídio e consideramos um feminicídio político. Então, parte das nossas articulações de solidariedade tem tido na figura de Marielle uma importância, porque Marielle representa, uma mulher negra, estava no âmbito político e representa o modo como tem sido inacessível para a gente essa articulação com a política institucional.
So I want to now turn to resistance and what that looks like now in Brazil, and the centrality and the symbolic stakes and significance of Marielle Franco in how in the current moment. And Marielle Franco was an assemblywoman in Rio. She was brutally assassinated, and the movement activists have recast that assassination as a matter of political feminicide. And it's a case that has also struck a chord because it speaks to the barriers and how the society is wired against the possibility for this kind of for Black feminism to make its way into politics, and the response to her assassination has been that it is vital and it is the way forward.
Então, em função do assassinato de Marielle e da não identificação do mandante do crime, nós nos articulamos muito em torno de agora de uma disputa política. Então, por um lado, a solidariedade tem sido nossa nas ações do aquilombamento. Aquilombamento é um termo que vem da ideia de quilombo, que eram sociedades construídas durante a escravidão, mas que mantinham um certo segredo com relação à sua localização e com relação às suas práticas emancipatórias, mas a gente tem visto também muita a necessidade de que essa solidariedade se articule em termos de ocupação de espaços públicos. Então, no Brasil, nunca houve um momento em que as mulheres negras demandassem por uma necessidade de ocupação de espaço públicos, sendo eleitas vereadoras e prefeitas, para que a gente possa se rearticular em termos da construção de uma nova sociedade. É claro que a gente sabe que a construção não se esgota nisso, mas a gente entende que não demandar por ocupação desses espaços se constitui uma impossibilidade de que a gente realmente transforme a estrutura racial brasileira.
So, the response to the assassination has been the rallying cry to how to defy these restrictions to the occupation of political space by Black women, and the significance and implications for what that occupation would mean. And so this begins to touch on the cultural stakes, the stakes in terms of language. Angela gave an example of o quilombamento of our politics, of our activism. Quilombos it's a religious community constituted historically, socially in relation to abolition and escaping slavery, unique to Brazil's history. So how to bring those processes into political activism, into the permeation of this space that has been held back and kept from Black women, and an understanding that this occupation, taking this space, can no longer is urgent and is the only means through which to fundamentally dislodge these structures.
Então, para terminar, eu quero dizer que o feminismo negro brasileiro agora compreende que é necessário essa rearticulação em torno da política, porque o movimento de mulheres negras, o feminismo negro, tem uma agenda muito maior e que articula as necessidades da população negra de um modo geral, acesso à educação, saúde, água, enfim. Então, essa compreensão de que é preciso a solidariedade e a resistência ao racismo, ela tem que passar por uma reestruturação da democracia no Brasil. Quer dizer, uma frase que temos dito como palavra de ordem é que não há democracia sem igualdade racial. E para ter igualdade racial é preciso estar presente e transformar as instituições por dentro. Muito obrigada.
So to end, I just want to say that this kind of Black feminism centered around the rearticulation of politics itself in Brazil, it is wide-ranging. It takes us to education, it takes us to health, it takes us to access to water. It is a solidarity around restructuring of our democracy, and it's an understanding that there is no democracy without equality.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela and Eudice. There's so much there I want to touch on. There is so much there. I think first off, thank you for even talking about anti-Blackness beyond just talking about death. I think that for so many individuals, their understanding of what anti-Blackness looks like, or anti-Black racism specifically looks like, is in context to George Floyd, to Mike Brown, to Trayvon Martin. But it is important that we also are talking about what is happening to us while we're also living poisoning, dehumanization, neglect, assault, stopping young women from accessing their reproductive rights. These are also things that are slowly killing us as well. We are still dying as well during these things. And I think it is an important reminder to us that we are fighting like hell for those who have passed, but we are fighting even harder for those who are still here. Our work is not done while we are still living and still experiencing anti-Black racism in all these different spheres. So thank you for that, for mentioning that. I also I really resonated in all of the conversations about Black women. In organizing with BLM and organizing for Black liberation, I have found that it has taken so long for us to talk about Black women. It takes so long for actually talk about what it is actually Black womanhood comes with, and the risks that comes with that. We too are also being killed, and we too, while alive, are also facing such violent anti-Black racism. In 2015, I want to say, we joined on the campaign Say Her Name, and we did that because we found that it was so quick and so easy for us to know the names of Black men who have been killed, but if it's a Black woman, a Black trans woman specifically, we have no idea who these individuals are. Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Chantal Krupta, these are individuals, Black women in Canada, that have also been killed or shot by police or experiencing anti-Black racism. And so it's important for us to also name that. And we also see in the case of Marielle Franco, what happens when Black women take up space, what happens when Black women are at the front lines, what happens when Black women are fighting truly for us all. And so the question that gets posed, the question I always sit with, is how do we keep each other safe in understanding what it is like for us while we are fighting back. And the last thing I will say before I ask the question I had to ask you, Angela, I hear a lot of what is happening from what you've indicated in your context in Brazil, and seeing the fascist wave that has come through, the militarization, the alliances with the militia. And I think that this is something for us all to keep eyes on, because we know that the waves happen and they come and find us whether we are ready or not. And in my organizing, we've seen what happens when we are so close to victory. We see what happens, when we are pushing back and getting closer and closer. And, in our case in Ontario, having somebody come into power that completely wiped out so much of the victories that Black people had gained, so much of the things that we had been fighting for on the streets, we were able to get inches of victories, movements of victories, and then somebody comes into power and completely wipes so much of that out. And so I think the question that I want to pose to you specifically, Angela, is in the face of such extreme fascism that you're currently facing, how do you continue to resist and build alternatives for yourself and your communities?
Well, nós temos, um pouco eu antecipei, pensando na ideia de que nós temos atuado de forma coletiva. Então, nós temos compreendido a importância das mulheres nessa atuação coletiva e temos tentado manter o equilíbrio emocional, o equilíbrio mental, o equilíbrio físico nesse momento de pandemia, de extrema demanda de que as mulheres negras têm em casa. Nós temos tentado trabalhar cooperativamente. Eu esqueci da tradução.
So I anticipated a bit of this, but it centers on a recognition that this has to be collective. It has to be about collective action. And collective action also means taking care of each other. It means emotional, physical, social balance. It means cooperation. It means being there for one another.
Então, temos criado algumas alternativas, algumas práticas de solidariedade frente à pandemia. Temos criado prática de solidariedade frente a situações de encarceramento. Temos criado prática de solidariedade frente a denúncias. E temos motivado, sobretudo as mulheres, da necessidade de denunciar a violência, seja ela de todas as formas, né? Física, psicológica, patrimonial, enfim.
And so a lot of this comes down to honing these practices of self-care, especially now with the pandemic, practices of solidarity in the face of mass incarceration, and practices for more effectively sharing, reporting, all the different layers of violence that we're facing. Violence that is most visible with the police, but also the violence that is being felt more intimately, including in the domestic.
Então, nós temos construído e fortalecido redes, então não temos a organização que eu faço parte, a gente tem construído e fortalecido redes para atuar coletivamente, não só no estado ou na cidade que eu estou, mas nacionalmente. Então, a gente tem fortalecido muitas das ações realizadas nos bairros, então, tentando dar visibilidade às ações realizadas por lideranças comunitárias, e desse modo, digamos, assegurar continuidade e visibilidade dessas atuações tem sido provavelmente a questão mais importante para que a gente não sucumba, para que a gente não desanime e para que a gente não desista da luta.
And so these practices, they work their way through a matter and a question of making sure that this is consistent, there's continuity. It means creating, fortifying these networks such that they are felt not just locally, but at the state, at the national level, but that they still are mindful of the specificities at the neighborhood level, that they support the kind of leadership that will keep it going. And so that there aren't these gaps that could lead us to fall and succumb to this spirit of hopelessness and despair.
É claro que no contexto da pandemia, muitas das nossas ações elas têm sido muito mais virtuais do que presenciais. A gente estava no isolamento social até muito recentemente. Mas mesmo no isolamento social, conseguimos fazer doação de alimentos, trabalhar coletivamente para que as pessoas tivessem acesso à comida, apoiando várias organizações. Então, a rede social tem sido algo muito importante para a gente nesse momento, embora o Brasil, a rede social, o acesso à internet ainda não é democrático, então, muitas regiões você não tem um acesso fácil à internet, mas a gente tem se comunicado através disso e mantido, na medida do possível, ações. Então, nossas doações de alimentos, enfim, de recursos, tem sempre alguém que vai e trabalha fortalecendo essas redes mais locais. Então, há um âmbito mais geral, mais nacional, e a gente tenta fortalecer essas redes locais, que é quem está no cotidiano das comunidades.
And of course, with the pandemic, this activism is increasingly taking a more has a more digital face to it, with increased kind of activism to deal with the most urgent and pressing demands, with grassroots fundraising to combat the hunger that is being felt on the ground, and strategies for coordinating the extent to which our digital networks, some are speak to a broader, more national audience, and others speak to very immediate local demands. And so making sure that that those are in sync when they need to be.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Eudes. I'm really sitting with the pieces about the individual care, the collective care, and knowing and including that as part of our praxis and how we are resisting. Thank you so much for that contribution. I want to bring in Stephanie into the conversation as well. Stephanie, I want to pose to you in the spirit of talking about the pandemic that is currently happening. I wonder if you can also speak to, we're currently facing multiple pandemics globally, pandemic on top of pandemic, really. From your expertise, can you speak to how we are experiencing a health, class, and racial injustice crisis simultaneously?
Yes, well, that is a very large question. But I was listening to a talk by the assistant commissioner recently of police, and she used the term parallel pandemic to talk about gender-based violence and COVID-19. And I'm sure this is the case all around the world, but definitely in Trinidad and Tobago, we're seeing an exponential increase in the levels or rates of gender-based violence since there have been lockdown measures. And so countries really need to start thinking about how they address that proactively so that we're not having more women murdered during this time, particularly because we have no real idea about how long we're going to be living in this new way. Yeah, so there's a lot of complications around people being stuck in one place who already have violent tendencies, who are out of work. So poverty is even more of a strain. There's anger and frustration boiling, and countries really need to start thinking about how they're offering proper systematic mental health services and other types of community-based interventions like mediation, and other services, social services that can really support its citizens at this difficult time. So you also said there was 3 parts: health, racial injustice, something else.
And class.
Class. Yes, well, of course, there are multiple class implications during the COVID-19 pandemic, things that we often take for granted. So, one of the main directives is to socially distance. And we know that poor people who globally tend to be Black or people of color who are living in situations of squalor in slums and ghettos, living in close quarters without proper running water or, just basic amenities inside, plumbing, for example. How are they socially distancing and how are they sanitizing in ways to protect their health? Because they're already vulnerable, and this, pandemic is making them either further vulnerable. And again, how is the state accounting for that vulnerability and responding to it in a systematic way? I know that, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, a lot of the focus is, economic stability and getting back out there, and the businesses are suffering. But what about the people? People aren't at the center. And in terms of racial inequality, I guess this is, again, part of the reason why we're here, is that we know that Black people are being disproportionately affected. And so when I mentioned earlier about the extrajudicial killings of 3 men from MOVA in Trinidad, at that time that sparked the uprising in Trinidad in June and July, there were already 43 people killed by police. And we're talking here about a very small island with a population of about 1.5 million now. And so it's really disturbing. And we see more and more incidences like this happening more or less on a weekly basis. And not only are Black men being targeted and killed, but now we also see the killing of migrants by the police. So that would include Venezuelan and Cuban individuals. And we're also seeing the deaths of migrant women by both migrant and Trinidadian men, mostly. So it's a very, very complicated situation. And I think that COVID-19 is really exposing a lot of the problems that were always there, but they're just being magnified in a particular way. And we really have to use this time to push our governments to do more, to think through things in a more systematic way and to act. We have to start demanding that.
Absolutely. I remember at the start of this pandemic, the thing that people were saying was that this was like the great equalizer. And I think Black people globally rolled our eyes.
Like I'm doing right now.
Like, I think we collectively all rolled our eyes as if that could be as if anything could really equalize us. And I 100% agree that our solutions actually need to be multi-pronged because we are all experiencing it in different ways. And I think that what I've seen, particularly in this context in Canada, how COVID has been used as a mechanism to additionally police vulnerable communities, right? Here, it's mandatory that you wear a mask everywhere you go. You can't take public transit, you can't go into any stores without masks, but how many places are actually giving out free masks? What happens to those who don't have access to be able to get masks, to buy masks, to be able to wear them? So we're seeing this, that's supposed to be something of an equalizer, is continuously being used as another mechanisms to police our communities, can police vulnerable people. Thank you for that contribution. Angela, you said something earlier too that I kind of want to hit on, in that you talked about the ghost of slavery. And that's kind of the question I want to pose to you folks both. I'm Haitian born, I was born in Haiti, and I feel like I see the implications of the legacy of slavery so much in Haiti. Haiti was the first country to kick out our colonizers, and I feel like we, in a way, have been, the colonial West has been trying to make us pay for that since our liberation. And I see how, our uprisings are so centered around our understanding of self and our understanding of identity, and our resistance to ever be a play project of the colonial West. But I see how my community is continuously punished for that, and still we resist. So I'm wondering if both of y'all can speak to the ghost of slavery within your country and how your organizing combats the violent legacies. Angela, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. Eu penso que o fantasma da escravidão, ele está nas instituições, ele está na relação da polícia com as pessoas negras, ele está na violência contra a mulher. Então, a violência sexual contra a mulher é uma continuidade do estupro que caracterizou a relação colonial. Você quer traduzir, Eudes?
The ghost of slavery, it's made most manifest in our institutions, and we see it in the relationship of the police with Black people. We see it in the violence, pervasive violence against women. We see it in the sexual violence, in rape, and the centrality of rape to the founding of the nation state, the founding of Brazil.
Então, quando eu penso no fantasma da escravidão, eu penso também no contexto da pandemia, por exemplo. O governo brasileiro, como a maioria dos governos, tinha um slogan chamado "Fique em casa", numa atitude completamente autoritária e que desconhece o contexto das casas da maioria das famílias pobres. Então, mais uma vez, o fantasma da escravidão aparece na hora que a polícia chega a essas comunidades somente com o intuito autoritário de comando, e nunca de escuta, nunca de acolhida, nunca de encontrar soluções comuns. Então, ela está presente no cotidiano das pessoas que permaneceram trabalhando durante a pandemia, e aí eu quero falar mais especificamente das trabalhadoras domésticas.
I think about the pandemic, I think about the moment we're in. I think about the government, this authoritarian fascist government, responding by saying, stay home, in a kind of flippant way. Ignorant of the realities on the ground of Brazilian families, of our communities, the small quarters people live in, and responding and offering no solutions, but so-called law enforcement, with police invading intimate, private spaces in ways that are not new, but even more blatant, even more dramatic.
Então, as trabalhadoras domésticas se constituem efetivamente no elo de continuidade entre a escravidão e a sociedade moderna. No Brasil, as trabalhadoras domésticas, até a PEC recente de 2016, a PEC da doméstica, que é uma lei que garantiu alguns direitos, as trabalhadoras domésticas era a única que não tinha os direitos assegurados a qualquer categoria profissional.
You see it, of course, in our domestic workers. These are Black women, mostly Black women, who represent this continuity of subjugation, of repression, of precarity, and that status not being out of the reach of the law until only just recently.
Então, muitas das trabalhadoras domésticas, o trabalho doméstico foi considerado o trabalho essencial durante a pandemia, e muitas trabalhadoras domésticas continuaram a trabalhar em casas onde alguns dos patrões foram contaminados pela Covid-19. Então, situações de desumanização, como esse que eu apresentei anteriormente, em que, no contexto da pandemia, as escolas fechadas, Mirtz, a mãe de Miguel, vai trabalhar e leva a criança com ela, e a criança morre, ou a criança é assassinada, né, pela falta de cuidado. Não foi uma morte intencional, mas a criança morre pela falta de cuidado da patroa. Isso é resultado do contexto da pandemia, do fechamento das escolas, e a trabalhadora doméstica levou o filho porque não tinha com quem deixar. Então, essa ideia dessa continuidade desse trabalho que não é reconhecido, esse trabalho que é perigoso, esse trabalho que é realizado por mulheres negras, e esse trabalho sempre é subjugado no terceiro mundo, né? Eu sei que nos países do primeiro mundo o trabalho doméstico são bem remunerados, ou são relativamente bem remunerados. O trabalho doméstico aqui é um salário mínimo, que, como eu mostrei anteriormente, é menos de $200, e todo esse processo, digamos assim, de que a trabalhadora doméstica, assim como as mulheres escravas, elas continuam, digamos, oferecer os serviços independente do contexto social, como esse contexto da pandemia.
And even with this, with very recent attempts to offer very minimal rights to domestic workers, we see some of those rights being pulled back. We see, in the context of the pandemic, Black women being labeled and thought of, domestic workers, as essential workers, but that no safety, no basic precautions are being made. This is dangerous, increasingly dangerous work, very poorly compensated. And we see, in the case of Miguel, Black women without the support, without the safety net, having to bring their kids to the workplace and only to see him die at the hands of her own employer. And so the continuity of slavery is very visible in that regard, where the subjugation is so blatant. The minimum wage is so low, and women have to offer these services because they don't have the freedom, and that freedom is not the marketplace offers very few other options.
Thank you for that. And we're seeing very similar circumstances happening in Canada too, with our domestic workers, our migrant workers, our PSWs, predominantly Black folks, women, immigrants, new immigrants, undocumented immigrants, working in conditions that are disproportionately affected by COVID, and yet still not, having the pay that reflects that they're doing essential work, not having the support, the respect that shows that they're doing essential work, but being called. My mom's actually a PSW, and she laughs all the time. She's like, they keep calling me a hero, but they're not showing me that they actually respect me as a hero. And it's clearly a global issue that is currently happening. Stephanie, can you also speak to the ghost of slavery as well?
I sure can. Actually wrote down this quotation, and I was waiting for the right time to use it, and I think it's now. Somebody a long time ago must have sat down and said, Trinidad will be the land of purgatory. In this land, we will create systems which will frustrate and divide people. And they did exactly that. So this is from Philip Franco, who is a medical herbalist and also a marijuana activist, and clearly a poet who has really captured, I think, the post-colonial disposition, around the world. I think, the specific example that I want to use now, because, obviously there are many, is the issue of the Christopher Columbus statue. Now, this has been an ongoing saga here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I have personally been involved in the advocacy around its removal for at least the past 4 years. Unlike Philip Franco said in his quote, clearly these systems were not meant to work and to just frustrate you. Yeah, because well, first of all, we should just talk about the really complete insanity that the Christopher Columbus statue is currently located in our Independence Square. It is literally called Independence Square. And here we have a Christopher Columbus statue in it. And not only is it there, but it's the only part of the entire square that is cordoned off by a fence and has a lock. What? Which is really interesting for many reasons. One, I think because the state did it as a means of preventing homeless people from having somewhere to sleep. Because years ago when I was young, I remember seeing people sleeping there. And clearly they don't want that. But two, it's to protect the statue. And, we've been going back and forth with the city of Port of Spain mayor and the regional corporation there to try and get this statue removed, politely, going through all the bureaucratic channels. And now they want to put this to a referendum because the mayor was like, oh, this is a nationwide issue. And, everyone needs to weigh in. But I'm sure that the majority of the population don't even know where this statue is. And don't really care because it's not actually a historical site. This is just something that the government says as a way to uphold this legacy of coloniality in order to keep us in our place, and to continue feeding us the lie that Columbus is an important part of our history that we must respect. And on Indigenous Day this year, we held, I wouldn't even call it a protest. We had an event in the park facing the Columbus statue that was attended by the queen of the Indigenous community here in Trinidad and Tobago, and a number of other groups, the Warao tribe, and other Black folk that support that, including the Crossroads Freedom Project, who's been kind of leading this, movement to remove the statue. And, the police were out in full force while we were just singing and having a good time, lighting our incense and myrrh, to protect the statue. And it's really amazing how much resources the government is willing to spend to protect a statue over protecting people. And for me, it's a comically outrageous example of how invested the state is in upholding a colonial history that no longer serves its people.
Absolutely. And we're currently actually here also in a battle about statues. And it is really ridiculous how we see how quick they are to protect property versus actual vulnerable communities, vulnerable lives, and how quick and how often the state actually reminds us and doesn't allow us to forget the violent histories that our communities have faced. There are a lot of folks in the chat who are very, very eager to ask some questions. So I'm just going to ask the last one I have, and then we're going to move to the Q&A, to some of the questions that folks have posed. So the question I will ask to the both of you, maybe Angela, you can start us off. The question is, can you speak to the international work you've done and why you have found it important to work with folks in different countries? Angela, if you want to take us away.
Yeah. Eu penso, bom, Trabalhos internacionais ou de conexão internacionais têm sido importante para dar, eu acho que, visibilidade a algumas ações realizadas em diferentes países. Eu acho que um dos efeitos importantes, dentre outros, do movimento Black Lives Matter tem sido uma reivindicação de uma reconstrução da história, né? Eu acho que essa coisa que a Stephanie tocou e que tem sido importante de renomear as ruas, reconstruir simbolicamente os espaços públicos, enegrecendo seus referenciais, tem sido algo muito, muito importante. Eu disse, você quer traduzir?
So international work has been vital as a matter of visibility, especially around certain causes. And for instance, one of the connections that we see with Black Lives Matter in terms of its influence here is what it has meant to us in seeing the possibility of the reconstruction of space, new meaning we can give to history itself, how we can recast its significance and reaffirm, and put things in their place.
Então, essa proposição de renomear as ruas que têm nome de colonizador e de escravista, eu acho que esse é um aspecto muito importante, sobretudo para mim, que estou numa cidade que é a primeira capital do Brasil. Então, é uma cidade extremamente colonial nas suas ruas, na sua arquitetura, nas suas dinâmicas, e que essa possibilidade de reconstrução da história tem um significado muito positivo.
We see that in now increased calls to rename streets once named after slave owners, and in just the broader architecture of cities and spaces in Brazil that whose aesthetics are so mediated by a colonial history.
Então, esses processos de formação, eu acho, de redes internacionais, na Escola Feminista Negra, nós temos, já é o terceiro ano da escola, então vamos para o quarto ano, que esse ano não houve em função da pandemia, mas a ideia é trabalhar, sobretudo, uma linguagem comum. Uma linguagem que não expresse somente as demandas, as agendas do norte para o sul, mas que a gente possa ir construindo isso juntos, a construção de uma agenda coletiva, e não apenas a gente ser encaixado numa agenda preexistente. Eu acho que isso é determinante na construção de qualquer plataforma, qualquer política, qualquer conexão internacional de combate ao racismo.
And so I think about this too in my work with the Black Feminist School. An initiative Angela Davis is a part of. And one mandate that we see for ourselves is about cultivating a common language, a language that can still overcome some of the divisions that we might otherwise still face as a global community. How to overcome North versus South, how to break pre-existing frames. What kind of language can we start to formulate that bridges us?
Então, pensar na linguagem que não diz respeito só à língua falada, que é sempre o inglês, mas também quais são as linguagens que a gente pode trazer, quais são as agendas. Obviamente, é preciso construir uma solidariedade transnacional de combate ao racismo, mas é preciso também ter uma escuta do que os outros países vivenciam, quais são as histórias locais, os desafios locais, para que essa agenda efetivamente represente uma associação global.
And so it's not just about finding a language, thinking about it through English or thinking about it through one particular framework, but how do we build a transnational community, transnational network that is responsive enough, that has the bandwidth, that is capable with the capacity to hear, to listen?
Então, na experiência, eu estou falando de uma experiência concreta, poderia falar de outra experiência, mas eu estou utilizando a experiência da escola internacional. A vivência, o fato de estarmos juntas uma semana, numa cidade extremamente colonial, que foi importante para o período da cana-de-açúcar, uma cidade que tem uma forte história negra, exatamente pelo contingente populacional negro, em função da mão de obra negra necessária para o plantio e coleta da cana-de-açúcar, mas também um país do terceiro mundo, em que a internet não funciona direito, em que não existe Uber. Em Salvador tem, mas nessa cidade pequena não tem Uber, tem mototáxi. E todas as condições efetivas, que parecem uma coisa pequena, mas é preciso proceder deslocamentos. Deslocamentos são necessários para qualquer revisão crítica de si e de sua própria sociedade.
And so, you know, I think about my experience with the school. Like, there are others I can draw from, but the school is exemplary of this, of just the challenges, you know, the real world challenges, how to do this, how to really make this happen, where, you know, bringing Black allies from different parts of the world to, for instance, a specific town in Brazil, a colonial town, where there are all kinds of, you know, issues that come up, issues where there are expectations that there might be Uber available to some of the guests, and that's not available. Internet may not work in a way that you know, other allies who are joining would have expected. And so some of those frustrations, some of those displacements that are inevitable in this kind of work, we should be, you know, we should be prepared for, prepared to be uncomfortable.
Então, essa experiência particular da escola tem me mostrado que o tempo de vivência juntos é determinante para empatia, para construção de afetos, para pensar nessa agenda. A gente nunca teve, durante esses 3 anos, a gente nunca teve tempo suficiente para conhecer o outro, né? E é aquilo que eu falei do deslocamento. Então, operar esse deslocamento, viver em outra sociedade, compreender como o racismo opera em outras sociedades, perder a segurança, porque o Brasil é um país perigoso para nós mulheres andarmos na rua. É um país perigoso para a experiência de gênero e raça, independente de ser uma mulher negra ou uma mulher branca, é um país perigoso para as mulheres. Então, o que é esse deslocamento, o que é vivenciar tudo isso, eu acho que permite a construção de agendas que englobem muito mais do que uma experiência única que se universaliza. Embora o racismo, obviamente, está em todas as sociedades, elas têm particularidades. E conhecer essas particularidades é fator determinante. Conhecer as experiências desses países é determinante para que a gente fortaleça a construção de uma narrativa, de uma linguagem comum, de uma sensibilidade comum, de um tempo, talvez, que a modernidade não seja a mesma para todos os países, né? De pensar que há múltiplas modernidades, há múltiplos capitalismos, então a gente está num capitalismo extremamente periférico, com alto nível de desigualdade. Então, o que é vivenciar o racismo nessas condições? De um país que é muito recente o processo de democracia. A gente, nos anos 70, estava lutando para dizer que não existia democracia racial. Agora a gente está lutando para dizer que não há democracia sem igualdade racial. Então, um país que saiu da ditadura há cerca de 30 anos, 30 e poucos anos. Então, como tudo isso se configura, por um lado, na relação entre democracia e racismo, da experiência concreta, das histórias particulares, mas da necessidade premente da construção de uma agenda comum antirracista.
Okay, let's see if I can get this. So the experience has been vital to really think about how we can cultivate empathy, you know, across our own lines within the activist community. That these displacements are part of the learning process that through each other's different contexts. We have to go and feel and experience what it's like to live through a particular kind of racism, that there are racisms that are universal, but there are racisms that have their particularities. And to, to learn from each other, and that is the path through which we can better fortify, better expand a common narrative, a common language, a common sensibility. Because there are different capitalisms, there are different inequities, and the ways in which those converge in different contexts need to also be heard and spoken to. And in Brazil, for instance, we're still fighting for democracy as early as the 70s. And now we're fighting for a democracy that can make racism and the overcoming of racism it's central to its own definition. So it's a different fight for democracy, and it's unique to this particular historical social political process.
Nice.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Judith. Stephanie, I'm going to throw it to you to be able to answer.
Yeah, so for me, I think that a lot of my global work has really been around Black solidarity, particularly in my region, and particularly with Black women. So, for example, I would have been one of the core organizers, I think 4 years ago, of the regional Women's March Life in Leggings, which was the brainchild of a Black Barbadian feminist, Ronelle King. In the same way that I would have, done advocacy and written statements in defense of Yugi Farrell from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who was institutionalized against her will, presumably because of an affair that she was having with Vincentian Minister of Government. And so for me, I suppose part of my responsibility as a Caribbean feminist is to support other Black women that are doing this work and who understand the intersectionality of being a woman, of being Caribbean, and of being Black. And I also wanted to mention, my own participation in spaces that have allowed me to have particular kinds of solidarity with Black women outside of, I suppose my own direct efforts, and particularly because Angela is on the call. But I would have participated in AWID's 2016 Black Feminist Forum in Bahia, Brazil.
Oh.
And yeah, I think I may have met you there, I'm not sure. Yeah, but I think that, the fact that a Black woman in AWID had the idea to have this Black Feminist Forum, bringing Black feminists from all over the world together to have a specific dedicated time before everyone else arrived was really an important vision. And the representation of the Black woman there was very different from what you might think it would look like, which was like, for example, a lot of Black Americans or a lot of Black British folks in particular. It was really a lot more diverse. And I think that kind of Black solidarity, particularly around Black women and Black feminists, is really important, because at the foundation of it, I think we all have a particular kind of understanding or perspective because of our intersectional identities and positionalities against multiple types of oppression. So yeah.
Snapping my fingers at all of you folks and all of the contributions both of you folks have said. I think particularly too, like, being involved in a global movement, BLM is a global movement, but often feeling like in my organizing, I'm a refugee, right? I'm a Black refugee at that. And so not, being, I think, in solidarity with folks here, understanding also what impact here as having on my home country. Those kind of tensions definitely exist. But I resonate so deeply with what both of you folks have said, but particularly Angela, in the overcome the divisions, because I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that there will be inevitably. White supremacy has done that. We will have divisions, but how can we continue to move forward and, like Stephanie mentioned, have the solidarity with one another that is absolutely crucial, because if not us, then who? That being said, there is 5 minutes, and I do want to at least go to one of the questions some folks have asked. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback throughout this. Folks are really enjoying this conversation. The last question before we close out, I will pose to both of you. In standing in solidarity with Black lives worldwide, especially during the pandemic, what are some practical strategies we can take up to show our support and take action? That's from Chantel Leslie. Whichever one of you folks want to start. Stephanie, maybe you want to start us off this time?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to be in touch with people. Mm-hmm. I think, identifying yourself as an quote unquote activist comes with a particular level of privilege, as does being an academic or an intellectual or whatever you call yourself, the kind of people that you might find in forums like this. Mm-hmm. And it's really important for you to understand the lived experiences of people who are being most affected, even if that includes you, because the point is that Black people aren't a homogenous group, and we have various intersecting points of oppression, and we need to fully understand what those look like, that is informed by the people. So I think that's a first step for any person who wants to get involved, is to reach out. I know it's obviously difficult and there are a lot of limitations because of COVID-19, but find ways, if you're really committed, to reaching out to the people who are experiencing high levels of stress and trauma and just having a really hard time right now. Listen to them and use your positionality to try to offer support in the ways that you can, genuinely.
Thank you. Angela?
Pascal, can you ask me again?
Yes, I for sure can. Let me just find it. In standing in solidarity with Black lives worldwide, especially during the pandemic, what are some practical strategies we can take up to show our support and take action?
Então, o que temos feito em termos... Where is Eudes? Eudes? Ok. Temos feito algumas ações, é isso que ela pergunta, né? Eu me perdi na pergunta.
Ações práticas. O que pode fazer agora?
Com relação à pandemia?
Para ser solidário.
Uau! Acho que depende do contexto. Então, se a gente quer falar do contexto da pandemia, eu acho que ser solidário agora é contribuir para uma outra forma de consciência e sensibilização com relação à pandemia. Eu acho que essa é uma pandemia que foi convocado muito a área médica, mas como outras endemias, as ciências humanas, as artes deveriam estar juntos para criar formas de linguagem que trouxesse muito mais pessoas a ideia de se autoproteger, enfim, eu acho que a gente vive um momento, pelo menos no Brasil, no contexto da pandemia, que a pandemia tem sido respondida apenas pela área médica, e isso é uma limitação frente às comunidades que utiliza tantas outras formas de comunicação, e aí a arte é uma delas, né? A pandemia poderia oferecer possibilidades, já que há um aumento da violência contra a mulher, de uma maior igualdade de gênero, por exemplo, já que as mulheres estão assoberbadas de trabalho. Eu acho que solidariedade vão em diferentes níveis, no nível micro, que é o da casa, tirando a sobrecarga de trabalho das mulheres. Saiu uma pesquisa recente no Brasil mostrando como as mulheres têm trabalhado mais durante a pandemia. E no contexto político que nós vivemos no Brasil hoje, com as eleições, eu acho que ser solidário e ser antirracista é ter um voto negro. Então, é contribuir para que a representação política seja enegrecida e feminilizada. Então, eu acho que tem diferentes níveis de solidariedade pensando em contextos específicos.
So I want to respond to that by, again, emphasizing that context matters. And in this moment, what it means to show solidarity, to be practically engaged, means to speak to this moment, to the pandemic, to the fact that there's still work to be done to raise consciousness around the inequities, to rally our coalition together so that the arts and the academy and intellectuals and activists are working in concert, and not in silos around the tragedies and the inequities that we see. And too often in this case and in others, it's left to experts. In the case of the pandemic, too often we're deferring to the medical community when we should be working together. And we should assume the role that we have in this moment, in this crisis. But there are other issues, right? And this context is not unique to the pandemic. We're seeing violence against women increase in much of the world, especially Black women. So how do we engage? And one very central way is to vote, and vote for Black women. Vote for have our institutions represent our community. And I think that's it.
É isso. Então, acho que há diferentes formas de ser solidária na nação e que esses contextos eles desafiam a nossa criatividade, a nossa capacidade de escuta. As comunidades têm sido muito pouco ouvidas sobre como é que elas enfrentariam essa pandemia. E em todo isso tem sido atitudes globais, uma imposição do Estado. E para comunidades que viveram e que vivem o fantasma da escravidão, há uma resistência, obviamente, com relação à imposição do Estado. Então, a gente não pode deixar que apenas o Estado diga como, se e quando as coisas devem ser feitas. É preciso sensibilizar um conjunto de atores sociais para essa escuta de como é que as pessoas gostariam que esse problema fosse resolvido, porque, de algum modo, a gente subestima a capacidade dessas pessoas de oferecer respostas.
And so to end, just to say that these challenges are also a challenge that we should embrace, we should take up, for they challenge our creativity. They challenge our ability to find solutions. They challenge us to think about our societies anew. The suffering on the ground, we can't, especially in societies where the legacy of slavery, the ghost of slavery, as we spoke to, still have a tight grip on our imagination. We can't just wait for the state, because so often the state is getting in our way. We have to work around the state. We have to also listen to the communities on the ground who all too often have solutions that they're ready to share, but we need to know how to listen.
Thank you. On this question particularly, I just want to throw out one other thing I would also add to that too. For folks who are joining, I think also another way that you can show solidarity to global Black lives is call on our government to actually stand in solidarity, call on our government to stop providing weapons to those who are oppressing us, to stop actually having interest, political interest, stop intervening in our politics, stop having an interest in our countries and uprooting us. I think there are ways that we can hold our government accountable too for the role that they are complicit in what is happening to Black lives globally. Thank you folks for being here. I also recognize that we're running a little late, a little over time. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, Global Black Resistance. This is just the second day of Social Justice Week. There's still an entire rest of the week of programming happening. Tomorrow specifically, at 10 a.m., Care for Those Who Care for You, United for Domestic Workers' Rights, happening in the morning, a little bit of what we were talking about, domestic rights. In the afternoon at 5 p.m., Food Justice in a Time of COVID. An entire week full of amazing programming, social justice programming. Please attend the rest of the week. Thank you to Brian, to Corey, to our captioners, our sound interpreters. Thank you to you two badass women I'm able to sit on the panel with. Thank you, Kike, for the opportunity. And thank you all of you folks for joining in. Thank you for participating in these conversations. And thank you for adding to this, adding to our conversations and committing to our global Black resistance. Thank you, and we shall see you folks soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.